Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. When the FBI showed up at Portia Louder's door, it was the beginning of the end, or so she thought. A federal judge sentenced her to the maximum 7-year sentence for her real estate activities, which involved falsified property valuations during the heyday of the mid-2000 real estate boom. 7 years? Portia had 4 young children at home, a loving husband, and a life. 7 years in federal prison was not part of her game plan, but what Portia didn't know and couldn't anticipate was a personal transformation she would face as she faced herself. Portia Louder writes about her remarkable journey in her book, Living Louder, and I am pleased to welcome her to this podcast. Portia, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. So I am 51 years old. I have lived in Utah all of my life, except for a few experiences, which I'll share. I grew up in a really small town in southern Utah, and I am the oldest of 7 children. My parents were really my mom was a hippie and my dad was a Vietnam vet. So almost like Forrest Gump. Like it was just really, so they were really different. And in our home, my mom was just didn't like structure at all. And she was really creative. So we didn't have to go to school if we didn't want. We could learn at home. And there weren't really boundaries or rules. And I think that there's so many beautiful things about that, but it was also difficult because when there isn't structure, there's a lot of chaos. And I think by the time I was 13 years old, I really started to struggle with any kind of structure. So school was difficult for me. And I think my first real struggle was thinking that what boys thought of me was the most important thing. And so, I started dating and spending time with boys that were a lot older than me. So at 12 and 13, some of them were 16 up to 18 years old. And I ended up pregnant at a young age, 17 years old, and then moved out of my parents' home and was living in a low-income apartment. And I remember thinking, I just need to find the right man. If I could just find that person that would just save me and fix me. And there's always a man out there that will, come to the rescue. And so for me, he was 10 years older than me. He told me, you should marry me. I can take care of you. And I remember thinking, okay. And a month later, we were married in his brother's backyard. So you can tell that I have just this really good decision-making process going on for myself. About that time, my dad was transferred out of that little town. And just to give you an idea, I had never been on an airplane. I had never been to the city. So my world was really small. I didn't have an education. I had dropped out of high school. And I came up to see my parents. And I remember coming to the city and thinking, there's like a whole world out here. And I went back and I told my husband at the time, I said, I could move up to the city and get a job. My family I had uncles that owned photography businesses, and I thought that was a good idea. And he said, well, I'll never leave this town, but we don't even really get along. So why don't you just go ahead and go and we'll file for divorce. And so I did and moved up to the city with my parents. And then I found out I was pregnant again. So, that's a pretty lonely time in my life. I remember calling my ex-husband and he said, yeah, I'm not going to pay child support and I don't want to be a part of your life or the child's life. And so I had a job and started to work and gained a little bit of confidence. But again, in my mind, the problem was just, I'd look around and think, those married people have it figured out. I just need to get married and everything will work out for me. And so I started to date again. And, I got pregnant again. It's just something that happens to me. I don't really know how to say that. I go into prisons now and speak, and I always tell people, and then I got pregnant again because that's what I do. This happens to me. But anyway, I was about 22, 23 years old, and I remember being really scared because I was a little bit older. I had a job, and I had two children that my parents were helping me raise, and so I hadn't been really of any religious faith, but I did say a prayer out of just, I need help. I don't know what to do. And I got the strong impression that I should give this child up for adoption. And again, I didn't really know what trauma is or how to work through things, but I just kind of powered through that. I met a great family and I chose adoption. And then after I had David, I just felt completely empty inside. I had these two kids, tried to go back to work. Doctors prescribed pain pills for after I had the baby, and I started using those regularly and ended up becoming addicted to drugs. And that was my low of my younger years. I kind of see it as two different times in my life, but I lost my job. Things got really, really bad for me, and I was leaving my children all the time. And my mom just said, maybe you should leave and leave the kids for us to care for, because it really, if this little boy who's been waiting for you all night crying isn't enough for you to change your life, I don't know what ever would be. And that night, I just laid on the floor and sobbed and really begged God, the God that I didn't know, but I just didn't know who else to turn to, for help. And I went across the street to a man the next morning who I knew in the community. I hadn't really met him, but I knew that he knew some people that knew something about recovery from addiction. And he introduced me to a man who was really honest with me. I remember him saying, you're a mess. You might be the most selfish person I've ever met, but there's help for you. And there's some things I've learned, like be grateful for when someone tells you the truth, because it's powerful if you're willing to listen. Even if you aren't willing to listen, down the road, when you speak truth to somebody, and I've had that happen on more than one occasion, it's a powerful thing and can be, a change moment for you. But I started going to these support group meetings. Now, the thing that was so strange, I didn't know anything about the, AA, NA, any of those programs. But when I went in, there was a man in the front of the room who had 2 years sober, and he was completely honest about all the crazy things he had done to get there. And I thought, how is he standing there and having been through some of the things I've been through? And he's all lit up. Like he had clearly had something happen to him that I wanted. And so I went up and asked him after. I said, how did you get to that point? And he said, well, you have to become a decent person. So it's like this really, okay, I'll do it. So I started working that program, and I made this promise to myself, like, I'm done looking for men. They're not the solution, It's about me. And so I started working internally on myself, and then I did actually meet the man that I'm married to now, which definitely wasn't looking. He had just graduated college, and his life was on a different path than mine was. And I'm not really sure. I still don't understand why Chad would marry me, but he did. I tell him I tricked him into it. I did a backflip off of a cliff at a lake, and he's like, he goes, I was so impressed because I'm pretty athletic and stuff. So he adopted my kids, and we started to build this life together. And I remember just being grateful every day for the life that I had, because I knew the difference. And I would get up in the morning, get my kids ready for school. I started my own company as a photographer, and things really grew. And I think that as I started incorporating these principles that I was learning in these group meetings and taking the time to kind of heal my soul, a lot of good things happened for us. We bought a home. The only problem for me was that I had more kids, which it isn't really a problem, but it's just what happens to me. And so I ended up having 2 more children, 18 months apart. So now I have 4 kids, 2 kids that are in elementary school that I'm trying to help through and they actually were doing quite well. Those children were. My business was growing. I think I went from like 40 weddings a year to 200 weddings a year. So now I have employees. My whole house is a studio. My schedule's from sun up to sundown, and then I'm working through the night. And it was a very busy time for me. And about that time, the real estate market started to go crazy. And so I hired somebody to help design a new home, and we started building a new home with a studio in it that was larger. And I had a back surgery. My back went out, and I relapsed on prescription drugs. And I remember being scared and not really being totally honest with myself about it, like thinking that I could just manage it all. And I had hired nannies to help with my kids, and I kind of had just grown so fast. And in the neighborhood that we built our home, the lots were like doubling in value. It was the 2005 to 2008 era, and then I thought, well, my way out of all this busyness with photography is to start investing in real estate, which I should have just slowed down. But so actually my husband quit his job to stay home with the children and help manage that. And then I got involved in real estate. And what I did, if anyone wants to know, I just bought houses, and we would bump up the value using other, comparables in the neighborhood. And then people would borrow more money than the house was really worth, but we would show it worth that on paper. And I remember the first time I saw a deal like that thinking I would never get involved in that. Like I could just feel kind of that that's not something I'd want to do. And then 6 months later, I've got all these lots under contract, and I'm totally involved in all these kinds of deals. And my life it might have been the worst time in my life. The heaviness, the fear, the insanity, the guilt of leaving, my kids and using prescription drugs. And I just couldn't see my way out. And then the FBI showed up. And just so you know, like that's about the worst thing that can happen. I'm sure there's worse, but it's just something you never want to have happen. When the FBI shows up at your house, you're like, just go away. Let me just, I'll just give you everything I have to just go away, and so scary. I was just terrified. And in the end, there was nothing that I could do. I made things a lot worse on myself. And I've learned that, a mistake is a mistake, but denying the mistake is a far worse mistake, because I ended up dragging that out for years, and it led to a worse situation for myself. I was facing a 0 to 7 year prison sentence, and I walked into a federal courtroom with my husband and our children. And if you've ever been into a courtroom, it's just a really not great place to be. It's very sterile. And I think for me, it was the first time that I could see how serious my situation was, because I had been denying that. And I went from thinking I might do probation to realizing that I was going to face the maximum sentence. And I probably deserved it for the way that I'd just been really difficult to work with. And I felt a level of loneliness that I never want to feel again, just looking back at my husband and children. And I got up and apologized to my community and my family. And then the judge gave me an 84-month sentence, which is 7 years. And I remember feeling like I died that day almost. I looked at my daughter, and she was 7 years old. And I thought, how can I be gone for 7 years? I just can't do that. And then the judge said, you'll be a mother again someday, Miss Louder. And it kind of shook me, because I thought, well, I don't think he can take that away from me. But, it was just such a weird experience. My husband got up and advocated for me and asked the judge to give me some time to say goodbye to my children, which was such a tender moment because of what I had put him through, to see that he loved me in that way. And then I was given 8 weeks to say goodbye to my children. And I remember leaving the courtroom and driving home and feeling like how I couldn't even speak. I was so devastated. I thought, how could I must be such a bad person to have received the maximum sentence. And then I thought, how could I have been such a fool? How could I have traded time with my family? It just clicked for me how foolish I had been to be so busy and money focused and, driven and in all the wrong directions. And then I spent the last 8 weeks with my children, just appreciating every moment that I had left. and said goodbye to my children. And then I walked into a federal prison. My husband drove me. There's not a prison in Utah, a federal prison. You have to go to a state nearby. So we went to California, to Dublin, California. And I walked in feeling completely alone and devastated and shocked. And, it took me a few days to gather myself together enough. I have written a book about this, but I don't share some of those details. After 3 days, I got on my knees and I just said, Heavenly Father, I feel like nobody to anybody. I'm not a mother, I'm not a wife, I'm not a friend. Nobody knows my name. I can't do this alone. I need to know who I am to you. And I felt the most incredible amount of love I've ever felt in my life sitting in a prison cell by myself. And I knew then that I never needed a man, that I just needed to know who I was. And I could see that I had an important purpose on this earth. And I could see that every single person in that prison was so valued and loved beyond anything I'd ever understood, and that they had important purposes on this earth. And I'm not going to say that the time was easy, but it made it completely different for me to know what I was fighting for. I ended up serving 4.5 years, and we can talk more about some of the changes that took place in my life while I was in prison. It was the hardest thing up to this point. I know things can always get harder, but up to this point, it was the hardest thing that I did, and the most sacred, beautiful experience of my life. I came to know myself and came to love others in a way I had never experienced, the connection that I felt, and the letting go, just letting go of trying to control my children, my family, the world, and just this acceptance of what was. Also, I think of freedom of, now what? Who cares what anyone thinks? Who cares what they do next? I'm a felon. I've kind of hit this hole, and now, I started to put together a list of things that I wanted to do in my life that had nothing. I want to be a good friend, a good listener. I want to have open, honest, meaningful relationships with others. It kind of took away all the worldly things that I had been caught up in and made me more open to things that really matter. And so that's some of it. I don't know. We can talk more about what happened in prison, but that gives you a good start.
No, it's an amazing story. You have so many great quotes in your book. One that I really love is, "We are not imprisoned by circumstances, setbacks, mistakes, or defeats. We are freed by our choices."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to a place where I realized that I got to decide. I had the ability to decide what every experience meant to me. When somebody said something to me, I could decide my response. When I think also just taking complete ownership of why I was there, that I had done this to myself, gave me the freedom to move forward and choose something different. Because it's so difficult to take ownership. I'm sitting around in a prison with a whole bunch of people, and we're talking all the time about how the government did us dirty. And it feels so good. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, And then at one point I realized, but we're not moving forward at all. What's the growth in this? There's nothing in this for me. I mean, other than just feeling really important sitting here in this circle. But actually taking ownership of the fact that I get to decide what this experience means to me. And, but part of that was really painful too, just taking ownership. I mean, I can't even tell you how painful it is to watch your kids grow up. They show up and visit you. There was a time where I went a year without seeing my kids, and they're teenagers. My kids were 12, 14, and 7 when they left. My daughter was 12. She went through all of her formative years without her mother. Not just without her mother, but her mother is in federal prison, and all of her friends. We live in a community where she didn't grow up with other people going to prison. She felt so alone, and went through a real depression. And for me, the only way forward was truth. I did this to us, Sadie. This isn't the government's fault. This isn't anyone else's fault. I did this. And that's the kind of truth that'll break you. If you can't get humble and recognize that it's the only way, it's the only real way forward is to walk through that suffering and allow the people you love to experience it too, and let them be angry. I mean, Sadie had to tell me over and over, I'm angry. How could you do this to me? Or I don't want to talk to you for a long time, which is understandable. But it's the only true way forward if we're not going to live in denial and allow these things to, it could have really set my kids up for a future failure if I wouldn't have been willing to accept that pain and take ownership of what I had done. So
one of the things you mentioned is that in prison, the relationships and the connectedness that you had with other people was very intense and very real.
yeah.
I'll preface this a bit. I'm fascinated by a concept in Buddhism called the middle way, which means, you experience this extreme, you experience that extreme. Somewhere in the middle is your truth for that moment.
Right.
How did having those close relationships in prison change how you meet people now?
I think one of the most beautiful things that I experienced in connecting with people in prison that has continued to carry through for me was this lack of judgment. And I don't know how to, I didn't realize how much of my time was spent trying to judge a situation, and I don't know if I was just at such a low in prison that I felt like you would think in prison would be all the more reason to judge based on what did you do? But it wasn't like that because we were so equal. Everybody's wearing the same uniform. Everybody's there because we've made mistakes. And in that lack of judgment in building relationships, it takes away it makes a place for just true connection and compassion, like understanding maybe this person did these things, but what was their life like? How did they get here? When you feel someone's soul that way without judgment, there's a true connection. And I desperately wanted that when I got home. And as soon as I got home, I thought, nobody knows how to do that. What's wrong with people? Like when I meet with people, there's all these pleasantries that I don't want to talk about that stuff. I just want to know how you're really doing, how you're really feeling. And so one of the ways I do that is I work in drug treatment because girls come in quite broken and they're more vulnerable. They don't have cell phones or anything, so I can connect with them that way. But also, I have just decided that if I speak a lot about my experiences, and when I do, I just think, well, maybe it'll make you uncomfortable for me to be super open and just say what I really need to say, but it's going to make me feel good. So, I'm just going to do what helps me as much as I love and appreciate you guys. So even, I'm a member of that LDS church. And they're very conservative. And I just got up when I speak, I just talked about going to prison and the things I learned. And at first people were just like, she's going to talk about it? I thought, of course I am. I'm celebrating all these awesome changes. And now people are pretty open to it, So that helps too.
One of the things I often ponder is we're very judgmental as a society. And I think I think it's partly because of the materialism. We are such a materialistic society. Who drives what? Where do you live? What do you wear? What clubs do you belong to? Where do you go to school? Where did you go to school? What is your job? Right. It's just endless. And in a way, stripping all that away really opens the door for amazing things.
It is the greatest blessing of my life to have all of that disappear for me. I think it's the greatest privilege for my children that I spent every dime we had trying to fight this case and then left with nothing. So my kids had to work 2 jobs to get a car but not just that, to be in prison, to have the same t-shirt that you wear every single day, to have 1 pair of shoes, 1 pair of shorts, and a t-shirt. I came home. Now I have 2 pair of pants, 4 black t-shirts, all from Walmart. I do not care. And I refuse to change. And when I work at this treatment center, I'll tell the girls that come in, just so you know, I wear the same clothes all the time. I just alternate. So don't think that's weird or anything. And I had one girl say, I thought you were just joking about that. I said, oh no, I'm absolutely telling the truth. And it doesn't matter. Same thing when I go to church. I have one outfit. I just don't want that stuff in my life. It's a distraction for me. So I think that was such a good lesson for me to just eliminate that, because it does make it easier to live without judgment. It just does. Or if somebody asks me to send a bio over, oh, tell me your accomplishments. I say, spent 4.5 years in federal prison. Drug addict. I just refuse to play that game. I just won't do it, So.
Good for you. It's really funny. I have far too many clothes, but at one point I sold my house and I took off for a few years. Mm-hmm. And I had only what I could carry with me or what I had in the car. And as a result of that, I had a wardrobe of jeans, black, white, gray. My favorite, you can't really see it here too well, but my favorite $20 shirt from Amazon, which really is a nice looking shirt. When it gets really ratty, I throw it out and buy another. Same thing. And for variety, I throw on a scarf. It is so wonderful. It's so easy. Right. You wake up in the morning, you know exactly what you're doing. And now that I'm a little more integrated into a community, I might change the color of my shirt on occasion. But the basic uniform is about the same. And people say, you look so nice.
I get compliments all the time, and it just makes me smile, because I'm like, these shoes I've worn every day, and when they wear out, I just buy another pair exactly like them. So it just makes life easy. Yeah.
How can we escape materialism in our day-to-day lives?
When I came home, I had boxes of fancy clothes that I just sent away. I think it takes a really conscious choice. And, for me, again, what a blessing to see all that energy that I had to put into studying and connecting with others and sitting in the sun and just feeling nature. I had that energy because didn't have any material things in prison. And that just, a lot of people would say, I can't wait to get out so that I can get some new clothes. I'm like, oh no, man, I wanted to take my clothes with me. I don't want, it just felt freeing. And I think because I had experienced such, this opposition in it, where money had been so important to me and accomplishment had been so important to me, and then to have nothing, it was very freeing for me. For me, it's been a choice. I think if you try it, maybe you go, I don't know, I look at, I have a lot of wealthy friends that have great big homes, and I look at it as, what a burden. What a burden that is. I don't want that kind of responsibility. To be able to travel is freedom. To be able to leave when I want is freedom. To have little means that I can take it with me wherever I go, and it just, the things that I need, I have. And I don't know how to help people find that, but I know that for me, it's been the greatest blessing of my life to have all of that taken from me. So,
yeah, you said something about trying it on, like trying on a new dress, a new lifestyle. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to go through an experience that causes a profound shift in your values and the way you see life, whatever that experience is.
I think you're right. I don't think somebody could have explained it to me and I would have given it a shot prior to my experience. It just wouldn't have made sense. But when you do have these life-changing experiences where you see the world in a different way, what a privilege is that? What a privilege is that people say to me, oh, it's so sad that you went to prison for your children. I can't believe it. And I say, can you imagine how awful it would have been if I wouldn't have? Can you imagine how terrible my children to have grown up and seeing me so caught up into money or getting away with something dishonest? Those things to me are more terrifying, to think that my children would not have had the opportunity to see that change in me. What did I teach my children? I taught my children who they really are, because it's really hard to give something to your kids you don't have. Now I know what matters. That's the best thing I can give my kids, and my integrity is so important to me now, to myself. I won't tell someone a lie or make up an excuse, because I won't give that power away to anybody. That's what I want to leave as my legacy, to never give up, to know that you're a lot more than this silly stuff that the world says you are. And it's one of the greatest privileges of my life. And I know I get people that say, oh, that's crazy. I'm like, well, and I think it can happen through illness or loss, through death. For me, it was prison. And I'm so grateful that I had the experience. So.
Do you think when you go through something and you have a profound change like that, you're more open-minded to the fact that at any time, any of us just have our own perspective? There are so many different perspectives out there and so many different ways to see things. Do you think you're more open to those possibilities?
Absolutely. I am learning all the time that I just see it one way, and I'm so grateful. It was when I was in prison, they gave me the opportunity to go to a treatment program, and I was really stubborn. I thought, I don't want to go to that dumb program. What's the government going to teach me anyway? And once I was reading like 12, 14 hours a day, every good book. I read out the whole library. I'm reading history. I'm like, I'll get my own education. I don't need them to teach me anything, And then I get in this program, and these women who have suffered unimaginable just pain and trauma in their life, who grew up with nothing from the time they were just little, they get up and they say something and they see it completely different than me. And all of a sudden I realize, like, look at what I'm learning from people all over from different cultures. I would not have seen it that way. But because of their experience, they have a completely different view on this. There isn't just one way. There isn't just one truth. I love hearing different points of view now. And before that, I just thought, to be safe, I have to keep in my box. I'm right, you're wrong. Those are the good people, those are the bad people, Just such a small way to live your life. So yeah, I think that's a huge blessing of going through something like this, to just recognize that we're all different and we all see the world so different, and we can learn from each other when we're open to that.
Well, and creating a box never works, because that makes you a square peg in a round hole. It's just never
Right.
going to fit, and it doesn't
Right.
allow you to evolve. And yet, society wants us to fit in these darn boxes, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I look back at my own mom and I think, my mom was anti-establishment, and she just believed almost that if everyone else is doing it, we should do it different. And if there's one thing I could go back and do for my mother, it would be to tell her how amazing she was, because I think that she had no idea she had this incredible talent and light and energy and love, and yet she had no idea what she was capable of. And I think that's why she chose a different path. She's like, I don't fit in with what they're doing, so I'm going to try it different, right? And for so many years, I was frustrated with that. I thought, why would you not give us any boundaries or teach us this or teach us that, And then I got to prison and I realized that I get to decide what this means to me. If society says you went to prison and it's bad, that's on them. I'm not going to accept that. And if, the people in prison think that we're supposed to act a certain way, that's on them. I'm not. And I realized that my mom gave me this gift of deciding what things meant to me. There's lots of things she struggles with and we all struggle with, for sure. But that part of my mother, her unwillingness to accept that because society says that we have to do it that way, has been a blessing to me in many. It's also been a curse, to be honest. It's been both. Probably would have been better if I would have been a little, wouldn't have gotten pregnant when I was 17 too. But it is brought me right here, and I'm grateful for that. So.
Yeah, I think it's the bumps in the road that make us. They give us the opportunity to decide who we want to be, and I think that if we don't heed the lesson the first or second or third time, it just keeps coming back until we do learn it. So, to be conscious and aware and recognize sometimes that the world is trying to teach you, I think that alone is an invaluable lesson.
Oh, yeah. I had in prison, you're getting roommates, so you don't always get to pick them. Mostly you don't get to pick who they are. And so I came up with some ground rules. Here's my mom, no rules, but I have rules. And my first rule was we never talk about each other behind each other's back. So if there's a problem in this room, let's do it openly. Don't come to me and tell me what someone else is doing. Do it with all three of us so that we can actually solve the problem, you know? And I remember my roommate once telling me, she said, I just can't stand that girl. I just can't wait till she leaves. It's going to be such a blessing when she's gone. And I remember smiling at her and saying, you know, I've been in prison long enough to know that you're going to get another roommate that's going to be harder. So you might as well just learn the lesson now, you know, because you will get that lesson. And it was the same with, I'm like, whatever it is that you need to learn from this person, whatever it is about yourself that you can learn from them, learn that as fast as you can, because another lesson will come until you do. And they get harder sometimes, you know, so.
No, I'm a firm believer that people are here to teach us lessons about ourselves. And the more you struggle with it, the deeper the lesson is and the more you need to learn it. And it's not easy, it's not readily apparent, but it's always a reflection of yourself because that's the lens you use to view the world. So it always goes back to your lens of the world. And that's hard it's hard to even see, much less accept sometimes.
But it's such an empowering view when you see it and accept it, because you realize that it lies within you. It's not something outside of you that you have to change. It's something inside of you. And yeah, that's difficult to accept, but it's also the empowering view when you realize that. So,
when you were in prison, you wrote an outline of your life using main events and characters and key experiences. And you wrote, I cannot emphasize enough how much this experience changed my life. How did that change your life?
Well, I think because I had so many, you could call it trauma. I think trauma is used a lot I work in the mental health field, but I had all these hard feelings surrounding events in my life. And so when I wrote out my life, I started out with these, kind of bigger things that I had strong feelings, whether it be judgment of myself or anger towards somebody else. And then I filled it in. And as I was able to do that, I was able to see my life in a much more objective way. I actually wrote a letter to my ex-husband and told him how grateful I was that I met him. And all the things, and I remembered every beautiful part of that, even though I look back at that and I'm like, I was just a child, I was a child, but it happened and I have good feelings about it. And I have talked to him once, we don't talk much, but I've talked to him once since I got home, and he said, that letter you sent me, it still sits on my desk. That letter was such a meaningful thing. He goes, I didn't write you back because I felt like I didn't have the capability to write you the way you wrote me. Like I'm not good with words. And I said, no, I'm so glad, I'm so happy that you got it. And that I just don't have that judgment of myself. I have a lot more compassion for myself and the people that I have crossed paths with. I think that again, I had one really traumatic experience that I was able to, as I wrote it out, it was so different than the way I experienced it. It was like I was looking at it from a completely different view. I'm like, oh, that's what happened. I think there's such value in being able to take an honest look and take the judgment out. When you just say, this happened and then this happened, and this, instead of just, he did this to me and they did that, you just put it on paper. It really did free me up so much to just acknowledge those things and let go of that judgment for myself and others. It's just freedom to see it, acknowledge it, and move forward.
Well, I think it allows you to show compassion to yourself. And I think that's really an important piece of our life equation, because until we can be compassionate to ourselves, we cannot show compassion to others. And then we just keep repeating the story of he said, she said, black and white. And the reality of the story is probably a lot more complex than that and requires a lot more care.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, as I have been able to hear other people's stories and have compassion, it's like it's allowed me to, I almost see my younger self as just this child that needed to be loved and known who she is. I read a book when I was in prison because I when I got in this treatment program, I started having panic attacks, which isn't something I've ever experienced. And I really felt so uncomfortable with it. I'd try to leave the unit and I'd just start breathing really heavy and get really insecure. And it was a strange feeling. And one of the gals that was in this program with me, she said, I said, I keep having these memories of experiences I've had that scare me. She said, well, why don't you go back and comfort yourself through it? No, I mean, how brilliant is that? So I'm outside and she's my friend that's not graduated high school, doesn't have a psychology degree, but in her mind, it just made perfect sense to her. And then I read a book about post-traumatic stress disorder, and it said the exact same thing. And I thought, well, two sources. So I would sit outside under this tree and I would just breathe and I would say, you're okay, Portia. You're so loved and valued. You're going to get through this, and someday this will be your blessing. And I, because I felt like I was dying at the time, and as I went back and I just remembered what I'd gone through and reminded myself who I was able to work through that. And that doesn't, in fact, I look back at it and just have a lot of love for myself. And even the people involved, they didn't know what they were doing. We all saw it so differently, but there was a time when that was just this huge monster in my life. And, I guess as I've been able to have compassion for other people and their stories, I've been able to do that for myself. And any people that crossed my path that I felt hurt by as well. And it's what you said. It's just beautiful to when you get that compassion for yourself and others. It's beautiful.
If you could distill just this incredible range of experiences and really rebirth down to a few points, 2 or 3 points, what would they be?
I think it would be you can't see it, but the hard thing you're going through has the ability to transform your life and become your greatest blessing. And if I could go back to myself when I really felt like when the FBI showed up, they were trying to kill me. Like in my mind, I'm like, you're trying to take everything I've ever been or could be. Who will I be if you do this to me? I'll never survive it. And yet here I am, and it's been the greatest privilege of my life. And so it would be to just be open to whatever it is that you're going through for myself. And even in the future, I'm going to experience loss and pain, but be open to the beauty and be willing to consider that there is a reason for this, and allow it to transform you. Allow it to. If you just open yourself up, be willing to walk through that pain that seems impossible to walk through, there's something waiting for you, the greatest gift. And I think that's a lesson I just had no idea. I had no idea what this experience would be. And then just the absolute value of honesty in your life, with your feelings, with yourself, with others. Be true, regardless of what the world will try to tell you. There's so much power in that for yourself and freedom in it. And I think that if I could go back to myself prior to this experience and instill a lesson for myself or give myself something to hold on to as I walked through this, it would be those two things.
If you could rewrite your story, would you?
No, there's no way. I would never undo what I went through to get where I am. I offend myself prior to this experience. I look back and go, oh, you poor girl. I would never undo it. No.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.